The night the house caught fire, the valley woke to a single thin sound that became a scream. Smoke swallowed the tiled roof in a slow, hungry rush. Embers smeared the sky like startled insects. Someone shouted a name, Don Rafael, and the sound ricocheted from shutter to shutter until it reached the little lane where Rosa Hernandez slept with the window cracked for the mountain air. The shout pulled her up raw from a sleep she rarely let herself keep for long. Her hand found the clay mug on the bedside table, the warm ring where it had sat all day, and she left it there. In the dark, she tied her hair back with the practiced twist of someone who had done it in kitchens and courtyards for 20 years. A muffled crash answered another breath of flame. Her son, a small silhouette on the mat, stirred and rolled away from her elbow. She brushed his hair with the back of her hand without waking him. He was 12 now, old enough to watch and learn, but still small enough to be soot-streaked and tender. She thought, only for a second, of taking him with her, of gathering him in her arms and stepping into the night, but the sound that had cut through the valley again, closer, rawer, moved her feet before thought could catch up. By the time she reached the Mendoza house, the courtyard was a loose ring of people. Neighbors clustered behind a low wall, faces lit erratically by orange. Children clung to one another like fig leaves. Someone hosed the lip of embers from a shutter. Someone else had already smashed a kitchen window to get a raft of chairs out. In the middle of the open door, a woman knelt and wept a single guttural sound that had nothing to do with heat or smoke. It was fear. It could have been any fear. Loss, shame, the sudden dumbness that lives in front of a fire, but it landed in Rosa as a point of choice. Don Rafaela's voice was a thin coal of a thing. Help. It came from the back of the house, where the rooms remembered him in portraits and cane handles, where old sweaters still smelled faintly of his pipe. Rosa turned toward the sound and saw the upstairs window vomit smoke in a black curtain. The tiles above it glowed like someone had lit the underside of a lantern. There was no time to line up for heroics. There was only a body-saving decision, and the steadiness that those who make them know, a tightening of the jaw, the release of every old muscle memory. She went up. The stairs bit with heat through her shoes. Smoke licked at my face and filled my mouth with a taste of iron. Her hands, the same hands that had ironed collars and unpicked stubborn knots in hem, were slick with sweat but steady when she grabbed the banister and hauled herself forward. A child's scream sprang from a neighbor's mouth and then subsided into order as others followed. But in that stairwell, it was only her lungs and the rasp of flame and the sound of a voice that might not last. At the landing, she stopped only long enough to gather a blanket someone had tossed to her, and then she pressed her face into it and pushed into the room. Ash spattered her forearms like early snow. The window, half choked with heat, gave when she braced her shoulder against the frame and shoved. The glass crashed inward like a verdict. A white flare crowned the sill. Hot air hit her all at once. She did not let herself think what she'd lose by going inside. She let her training, the little, constant training of someone who had learned to move in other people's lives without drawing attention, take over. Don Rafael lay on the floor, a stooped shape with a blanket over his knees and his shirt gone dark in a way that made the chest look wrong. His breathing was a ragged business. His eyes, when they opened, recognized the person he always did when he needed practical, steady hands. "Rosa," he coughed, as if the word was itself a milestone. She slid to her knees, wrapped her arm under his shoulders, and leaned into the plan that had no name. With a great collective shove from the room, they dragged him to the doorway. She felt the heat press at her back, her mouth filled with smoke, her throat closed. For a moment, the world narrowed into the weight of his pulse under her fingers and the sticky grit of soot under her nails. She pulled him loose of the floorboards and leaned her shoulder into his hips. And when someone shouted about water and where the ladder was, she heard only the thump of her own heart and the small, steady rhythm of his. Outside, a neighbor had thrown a blanket, and the workman Esteban, who had the look of someone used to being in charge, caught them and pulled. Rosa stumbled. The air turned plastic in her lungs. She could feel the heat at the roots of her hair, the singe over her eyebrows. Sparks found lace in her sleeve and smoked it like a reed. When they crossed the threshold into the courtyard, Don Rafael folded over her shoulder like he could be packed away. She felt the weight of him, the old man who had known her longer than most.
She felt, too, the stares of a crowd that had seen her cast out once and wanted to believe the easiest story now, that the woman returned to save a life was miraculous or accidental or convenient to whichever angle they preferred. Paramedics took over with efficient hands and quiet questions. A hose hissed. The clatter of equipment was like a small, practical army's. For an hour, or what felt like an hour, Rosa sat on a curb with her shirt damp and smelling of soot, the smoke in her lungs making her cough until her chest hurt. Don Rafael was placed in the ambulance, and the stretchers folded away like bikes. She watched the paramedic put a blanket around his shoulders and saw the look in his face shift from clinical to something softer when he noticed the ash in Rosa's hair. He said nothing about arrest or praise. He offered a water bottle and a paper towel.
People clustered in groups, their talk a low scuff of rumor and wonder. Some called her brave, others furrowed brows and asked questions so small they made room for louder suspicions. How did she get in? Who let her in? Why was she back? It was as if the flames cleared nothing, but left the old gossip's tinder to spark all over again. "Stay with us to see how this changes things," a neighbor said, a whisper neatly folded into a compliment. Rosa heard the hope in the words and felt an unfamiliar tightness in her throat. She took the soft CTA into the night as if someone had lit a candle in a ruined room. If you want to see how courage changes a life, keep watching. The sentence sat there like an offering and a dare. After the crowd thinned to a ring of those who had long memories or long grudges, Rosa let herself be led back through the yard by Padre Miguel. He had arrived, unsurprised, with the slow, steady steps of a man who had moved between parishioners for decades and learned to trust the tilt of people's shoulders more than their words. He placed his hand on her back, as if that touch could press the smoke out of her, and said nothing. In his silence, she found a small pool of normal. Rosa's body calmed enough for her to remember the small things that had always been hers: the clay mug with a chip on its rim, the photograph of a woman who never belonged to her by blood, but whose face Rosa kept folded in a scarf in the chest of drawers. Those memories were not epics. They were domestic choruses that had underwritten her days. Don Rafael had known them all: the way she soaked beans overnight, the way she ironed his shirts until the collars stood crisp. He had not been a man of many dramatic gestures, but he had left his kindness like breadcrumbs along the path of a house: a basket of lemons left on a windowsill, a private word about the weather when it rained, the time he told her quietly that she could use the back room for extra linens. It had been years since those small things had meant a thing to the town at large. The public had an appetite for larger narratives. A week of collective attention is a currency more volatile than coin. One winter morning, Valentina Mendoza, Don Rafael's niece, silver-clipped and always measured, had found a coin in the pocket of an apron Rosa had meant to wash. It was a small thing, a copper glint no one would have paused to explain, but Valentina looked at it as if it were evidence, and evidence is more persuasive at a stall than truth. The coin was the first in a string of little insinuations. A neighbor who owed a favor mentioned a missing jewel. A gossiping woman saw Rosa with a rolled-up packet of paper and imagined she had been stealing the house's accounts. Someone who had been friendly for decades could, in a single day, find the language to make suspicion stick.
Within a week, the small kindnesses that had defined Rosa's life, the times she had stayed late to mend a curtain, the times she had paid the gardener when the family had been short, were recast into a narrative of entitlement and theft. It happened in the market square, with the kind of quick cruelty that mass conversation allows, people speaking over cups of coffee, prescribing judgment with a short sentence. Rosa remembers the day they made her leave as if it had been a more public kind of weather. Valentina stood at the head of a linen table and read aloud a list of small items she claimed were missing. The servant girls and the yard hands had to stand in a row like schoolchildren. Those who had been friendly turned their faces away. Someone in the crowd said, under their breath, that she had been with the Mendoza house 20 years and might have thought herself owed more than speech. For themes of theft or protection, people will fill the holes with a story that comforts them. The town loved a neat story. The neatness was a blade. Rosa left with two things: the clay mug and the photograph. She kept the mug because it fit her hand. She kept the photograph because it was all the proof she had that there was a life beyond the accusation. Padre Miguel found her under a cathedral arch that smelled faintly of wax and old dust, and offered her the small, practical shelter of the church's guest room. He did not ask her to defend herself loudly.
He did not, importantly, offer the cheap consolation of a sermon about endurance. He made coffee and listened. His compassion was a steady, domestic thing, less thunder than a slow, warm rain. During those days in the church, she watched the estate from a distance. She watched Valentina take over dinners and management with the smoothness of someone who had expected to inherit attention. The house, which had always been a slow, breathing thing under Don Rafael's care, changed under Valentina's hand. Orders were sharper. Workers were watched. Rosa felt her absence like the missing weight from a hammock. The notary, Lenciato Fuentes, had kept a secret in his leather satchel years ago because Don Rafael had asked him to. Don Rafael did not like spectacle. He liked the right thing to be done quietly. One afternoon, months before the night of the fire, he had approached Lenciato with the sort of formal, careful hands that never seemed to tremble. He held a folded piece of paper and asked that it remain sealed until a reading with witnesses, unless he himself decided otherwise. He asked that an honest woman, Rosa, be remembered in the small obligations of the house, a few rooms secured for her, a ledger entry, perhaps a token of monetary relief. He asked that Padre Miguel be present, and that his foreman Esteban and the young housekeeper Lupita serve as witness, names chosen for their knowledge of the estate's daily life. Lenciato's satchel contained the testament, soaked not in drama but in legal circumspection.
He kept it wrapped in cloth and in a drawer. It was a procedural thing, a will, sealed, folded into the slow bureaucracy that moves like a glacier and then sometimes like a spring flood. He made notes, he filed them, he kept his mouth. When the accusations rose, when Valentina's suit of certainty covered the house, Don Rafael's hand reached for the satchel and his voice grew small. He wanted the document placed somewhere formal. He did not trust gossip to sift truth. He trusted paper to be stubborn. He told Lenciato to keep the testament sealed until the time was right. That day was, in the way of human lives, not purely a matter of legal calendars, but an accumulation of small mercies and small dangers. Lupita, the younger maid, who had been folded into the house like a new sheet, had been the sort to panic in the sight of a problem. She had been present when Valentina found the coin. She had been present when someone, no one ever quite agreed on the detail, saw a rolled pocket doll. No, that was how the gossip started, with the different edges of memory catching like a bad seam. Lupita had watched because she was loyal to both sides in her confusion, loyal to survival and to a woman who had once given her bread and a father's smile. Later, when guilt is a slow creature, she would think about what she could have said and what terrified her into silence. Esteban, the foreman, had the kind of face that made you trust it until you needed it not to be trusted. He had shown the house to strangers and kept its accounts. He had also, in the soft places of a lifetime, been susceptible to the idea that power was something to be exercised rather than shared. He had wavered that winter, once, toward Valentina's version of things. He would later tell himself he had been afraid of the consequences of a man who had been known to look kindly on his workers, and in that looking, had promised them such little things as regular bread on the table. None of those stories are dramatic at the outset. They are a collage of small moral failures, the sort that make human communities breathless and then forgetful. The sealed testament, however, was a prop with teeth. Paper will, occasionally, refuse to be lied about. It waits. Back in the courtyard, while the house was still hissing and the fire crews made their last passes with cold, the talk began to shape itself. Some spoke of the miraculousness of a woman who returned to rescue the man who had once sheltered her, as if the story had theology at its tip. Others, quieter, thought about the logistics. How had she gained entrance? Had someone been negligent? Had the foreman left a candle burning? Valentina, who had always preferred the painstaking brightness of reproof to the messy warmth of sympathy, walked the perimeter with the precise expression of someone taking inventory. She made a point later, saying to a reporter who had come breathless and eager, that the house was fragile and that gratitude did not absolve past misconduct. Her words landed like thin coins in the crowd. Some clattered and rang as right. Others hit the dirt. Rosa felt all the eyes measure her like coins in a palm. She had been exiled once on the basis of a story nobody had bothered to check. She had known the sharpness of that public measuring. The rescue had been an instinctive domestic response, a body to attend to, a life to move out of danger. She did not think of the way the public would want to repackage her. She thought only of breath and how to lend some of her steadiness to it. Don Rafael, when he could speak, coughed but smiled with the slow pleasure of someone who has been given back a concession of life. "You foolish woman," he wheezed to her, And there was no mockery in the word. There was something tender, like an old man scolding a daughter for running in the rain. You always did have a heart too big for your hands to hold. The paramedics spoke in clipped, practical phrases. Smoke inhalation, singed hair, possible carbon monoxide exposure. They recommended the hospital and a night of observation. They offered the small niceties of the professional, a thermos cup, an exclamation. Someone from the town administration, a man in a blazer who had not yet decided if he was more comfortable as bureaucrat or as spectator, began to ask about statements. Padre Miguel stepped between the paperwork and the person. He had the odd, useful habit of speaking as if there were more important things than forms. He also knew how to make forms happen. He put his hand on Rosa's shoulder and then, to the administrator, said the only thing that would matter in a small town. We will provide witness. We will see justice as it must be seen. Today we breathe. Tomorrow we speak of truth. The truth in small towns is rarely singular. It is a collection of voices, some of them loud and sharp. Valentina had offered hers already. Lupita had kept silence. Esteban had leaned into the shadow of his own indecision. The notary sat in his car with the satchel on the passenger seat, the cloth folded over the edge, unwilling to let rustic curiosities into an official ledger. He felt the weight of the paper there. He felt, too, the weight of the town's hunger for a tidy story. That evening, after the last of the hoses had cooled and the smoldering rafters had been declared stable, Rosa walked the perimeter of the yard with a neighbor who had once been angry with her and was now all softness. The neighbor touched her shoulder like a benediction and asked if she needed anything. Rosa said she only wanted to sit for a while with the photograph she had kept tucked into the pocket of her dress, the one of a woman who had taught her to fold sheets the same way, with the same precise corners that made a bed look like a home.
The friend nodded and watched the old house, its pockmarked walls like a face that had been in a small fight and would be fine. In the days that followed, Don Rafael recovered enough to make a request that would bring the town's attention a second time to the sealed satchel. He asked Linciato to prepare the document for reading. He did not do so impulsively. He had watched the house change hands and seen the way people, hungry for certainty, preferred to believe the loudest voice in a room. He believed the paper could correct the narrative, not because paper is infallible, but because it is deliberate. He wanted the reading to be public, with witnesses who could attest to the sequences of kindness and care that had been invisible behind gossip. Linciato, a man who lived at the intersection of law and ritual, arranged the meeting with slow, respectful precision. He requested that Padre Miguel be present and that the witnesses chosen be the same names Don Rafael himself had asked for years before, Esteban and Lupita, among others. He wrote down the time, and he sat on the reading as if it were a matter of tempering what the town would think. Paper is not an oracle, but it has heft. Not everyone was pleased at the idea that the paper might have things to say. Valentina bristled publicly at the suggestion of a reading. We cannot have old stories reopened based on private feeling, she told a friend, folding her handkerchief as if the action could iron out the future. But other voices, the quieter ones who had seen Rosa's steady labor for decades, began to speak more openly. Some brought cakes to the church, others delivered notes. The town, which had been an indifferent chorus, had begun to recompose itself into a battleground for memory. Rosa, who had not wanted spectacle even when she had risked life, found herself at the center of one anyway. She went to the hospital to check on Don Rafael because she had to be practical. He had always been someone she attended with the small favors that do not make the news but make lives livable. She left the hospital with soot still faint in the lace of her sleeve and a promise in her mouth to be present at whatever reading would be arranged. She did not let anyone call it vindication. She had learned that vindication is a slow thing. It arrives in ledgers and signatures and the reluctant adjustments of gossip. The notary's house smelled of old paper and citrus when Linciato invited Rosa in for a brief conversation about what would be required for the reading. He spoke with a gravity that was peculiarly legal and peculiarly human. Paper, he said, is only as good as the witnesses who raise it. He asked her, kindly, if she would be present, and if she could bring perhaps someone who had seen the everyday of the Mendoza house. Rosa thought of Padre Miguel, of Esteban, of Lupita, and of a long list of small, important people who had seen truth in the long run of daily life. She agreed.
Meanwhile, Valentina's efforts to maintain authority at the house were not without their own anxiety. She called meetings with contractors and accountants, and she wrote lists of repairs and expenditures as if the rusted ledger of generosity was her to keep sealed. In private, she called the notary to ask if the document had been seen, an odd phrase, as if a sheet of paper could be glanced at like gossip, and Lenciato answered with a professional curtsy that said the law requires procedure. Valentina bristled, as if law were a thing she could shape with will. Lupita, who had been quiet since the fire, found herself awake at odd hours. She had the kind of guilt that sits like a stone in a pocket. She remembered now how she had stood near the linen closet the day the coin was found and watched the way Valentina's face closed. She had seen something then, a movement in the shadows, a hand near an apron, but fear made her eyes small and her voice smaller. Fear is a practical skill. It keeps you alive while it narrows your choices. She had not spoken. The memory made her stomach twist like laundry on a line. Esteban, for his part, walked the property as if it were his head and could be rubbed into clarity. He had been all things to the Mendoza house for years. At night, though, he had nightmares of someone, no one in particular, asking him who had the moral courage to stand up. Pride is a complicated thing at the point when courage is needed. Sometimes it drives you to stand. Sometimes it shuts you down. The months that followed the fire were not a neat unspooling of justice. They were a series of small procedures with sharp edges. The town began to watch the notary satchel as if it were a character in a drama. Lenciato, who had little affection for theater, kept the testament in a drawer marked with a brass plate and a ribbon he had tied himself. He placed an official stamp on the letter he would send notifying the required witnesses of the reading. The law, like cooking, required time and temperature. You could not rush it without spoiling the meal. Rosa's son, waking each morning to find his mother at the table with the clay mug, began to understand the mechanics of being known in a place where reputation is often more valuable than cash. He watched his mother keep things small and certain, a list of chores, an envelope with the week's shopping money, a moment each evening when she would prostrate herself above prayers she said like washing. He did not speak much about the wider things. Children learn that adult stories are heavy and that their jumping across them is indulgent. He cleaned the soot from his mother's scarf because he had seen her save a life, and he wanted his hands to be useful. The town's cameras, phones now, little rectangles that made every moment public, documented the rescue again and again. Social media, that fickle town square, spun their own versions: gratitude, skepticism, anger at past injustices.
For every voice that said she did not deserve what was done to her, another whispered, "Why was she back?" The narrative hung in an uneasy balance, like a pot on the stove, simmering, about to boil over at a tiny tremor. One afternoon, weeks before the scheduled reading, Don Rafael's cough returned, and with it a clarity that made him insist the reading be hastened. If a paper is to tell the truth, it must be read before talk eats it away, he said. He asked Lenciato to move the date forward. The man in the legal coat, who had been living in the slow measure of documents, agreed with a smallness in his face that looked like relief. He wrote the new date in an ink that did not quite dry before he folded the sheet and put it in an envelope. The town received the notice like a summons. Valentina, hearing of the rescheduled date, made plans that looked like business. She sent invitations by hand, and she made an appearance at the local radio, where she spoke of stability and the importance of protecting the estate. But under her breath, she began to collect allies: a bank manager, a local journalist amenable to neat narratives, a cousin who owed her favors. She did nothing dramatic. She did what those who want to preserve influence do best. She courted the slow institutions. Rosa, meanwhile, kept to her steady work. She repaired what she could for the community, helping to stitch the servants' quarters with clean sheets and mended roofs. She did not demand recognition, but the recognition found her in small ways. A child brought a drawing. A neighbor left a warm pan of rice at her door. She moved through these small kindnesses like someone who knew that restoration is not a single bright act, but a long, patient sowing. The day before the reading, the town gathered with the kind of apprehension that comes when a long, complicated story is about to be told in public. People wore their best and their worst. They sat in pews and on benches, in the shade by the town hall, wherever the notary had decreed the reading should take place. Lenciato set the table with formal calm. Padre Miguel stood in the back with the small, careful look of a man who had seen small miracles of human decency, and also families fall apart in gossip. Esteban shuffled in as if he might drop a tool at any moment. Lupita came late and sat near the wall, her hands folded in her lap like she was holding a secret, and not sure whether it was a stone. Valentina, immaculate and composed,
sat near the front. Her eyes searched for advantage in the angle of the room. The town's cameras, little pockets of light, were arranged like a second audience. At the edges, people whispered, some making bets, others making prayers. The air held the scent of citrus and the dust that rose when a town waits on an official moment. Rosa came in with nothing more than the clothes on her back and the photograph in her pocket.
Her son met her at the door and squeezed her hand for a second, as if to say, without words, that he was there. She sat down and let the sunlight warm her face. It had been a long road back to this seat. The hunger of the town for a neat story had been a long, abrasive thing. She had learned to walk in the middle of it without losing the small, private things that kept her human. Lenciato opened the satchel, his fingers careful, and brought out the sealed envelope. The paper was thick, and the wax that had once sealed it had been pressed with a stamp that meant, in practical terms, that someone had placed trust in the document. He arranged the witnesses, looked to Padre Miguel, nodded, and asked Rosa if she had anything to say before the reading. Before she could form the words, a crisp noise, an argument, a shouting from the street, cut through the hush like a new flare. Someone had set a rumor into motion that Valentina had been planning to alter the house's accounts in a manner favorable to herself. It was the kind of whisper that fans old embers. People stood, voices rose, and an agitated hand reached toward Lenciato's table as if to tip the satchel and make of paper a weapon. Rosa felt the room teeter for a moment. The reading had been meant to settle things, to place facts into a ledger and let them be. Now everything bristled as if the town had decided to catch fire from a rumor again. Her stomach tightened the way it does when you know another choice must come, that the rescue she'd given had not ended the work at all, but had begun something new, something that would not be settled by one brave act alone. Outside, a van had arrived bearing the tattered camera crew of a regional station. Their lights painted the plaza like a staged miracle. Somewhere in the knot of people, Lupita's breath hitched, Esteban's knees flexed. Valentina's face, that practiced mask, began to show the faint tremor of a woman who understood that public life and private reckoning might finally collide. The satchel lay there between the small items of papers and a fountain pen. Lenciato lifted the envelope as if it were a fragile bird. He turned his head to the faces he trusted, and to the eyes that would have to speak for the town when the paper said something they might not want to hear. For a second, the notary's office was suspended like the opening of a drawn breath. Rosa felt a strange, cool calm. She thought of the clay mug in her cupboard and of her son asleep that morning under a single ragged blanket. She thought of Don Rafael's rough, grateful voice and of Padre Miguel's patient hands. She thought of the life she had sown with small stitches and the way the town's appetite could turn those stitches into scandal. The moment held like a hinge. Lenciato broke the seal. The paper inside made a soft, decisive sound as he opened it. The room leaned forward. Someone clutched a palm to their mouth.
The air was so dry with anticipation that a cough should have been expected and felt like sacrilege. Lenciato's lips moved as he read the first line. He read of domestic legacies and the quiet obligations a man owed to those who had kept his household together. He read of names written with the careful hand of someone who had lived through small and large graces and wanted to put them where others could see. For a moment, while Lenciato continued, the congregation of the town existed in a single taut thread of attention. Then, into the hush, a voice rose, a sharp, incredulous sound that could not be held down. Valentina's breath caught in a place that turned her jaw pale. Outside, the lights of the cameras flashed like a storm on the horizon. Rosa felt the paper's weight move from envelope to room like a small, insistent truth. She did not know yet if the words would change everything or nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap. She thought only of the rescue, of the night when flames had taken the roof and not the person. She felt the truth of being present for a life as a kind of work that quieted any desire for vengeance. She had rescued a life. Now paper might rescue her name. But paper will only carry weight if people agree to lift it. And the town, with its loves and its envies, its quick judgments and slow contritions, had yet to decide whether to carry that truth together or to let it fall into the dust. Outside the notary's window, a clamor began to swell, and inside the room, a witness rose to speak.
the sound of the door opening cut the reading short for a beat, and everyone in the room heard a second, newer noise. The ambulance siren down the street, and the distant murmur of a crowd approaching. The reading, the crowd, the cameras, the questions, all of it moved like a tide. Rosa sat very still while the words on the page leaned against the town's memory and forced a choice. The notary continued to read, but for Rosa, the last thing she saw before the scene blurred slightly at the edges was Don Rafael, looking at her with a strain of mischief in his eyes, as if to say, in the only way he could now, "We will see what the paper says." Linciato's voice folded the room into the lines of the paper. He read with the deliberate, faintly musical cadence of a man who had spent decades turning human choices into sentences that could be held and pointed at. The paper named small things with large consequences, allocations for certain rooms, a modest sum placed into a trust to be administered for the household staff's welfare, a clause asking that the house, when possible, fund a small clinic for the valley, specific instructions that Padre Miguel act as mediator should disputes arise. And then, toward the middle of the document where the ink darkened, the name that made Rosa's hands feel suddenly too light in her lap. Rosa Hernandez. The room changed shape at that syllable.
Some people began to cry very softly. Others gasped as if the air itself had been surprised by a fact. Valentina's face, which had been a mask of composed disapproval, tightened. Her fingers bored little tracks into her fan. She had counted on silence, on the town forgetting what it did not want to set its teeth into. Paper, Linciato had said, could be stubborn, but it also needed people willing to lift it. Linciato continued, the testament did not give Rosa the house. It did something subtler and more defiant. It made obligations public. It named Rosa steward of the back rooms and caretaker of the men and women who worked beneath the eaves. It directed that a small endowment be set aside for school fees and for the repairs of the servants' quarters. It required that the foreman keep transparent ledgers, that wages be settled on a weekly schedule, and that any apprentice hires be approved by a small committee made up of members of the staff and a representative chosen by Padre Miguel. At the end, in the way of men who know they will not be here to see everything he ordered, Don Rafael had scrawled a small line that read like a private instruction: practical mercy, not show; repair, not revenge. The room held its breath as the words landed. For Rosa, the paper was not the end of things. It was a tool that could be used to build the life she'd practiced for years. She felt the familiar steadiness return, the same lean of her body that had pushed a man out of danger, and thought of measures, ledgers, keys, schedules. These were ordinary weapons. They had teeth. When Linciato finished, a slow sound moved through the room like the deep part of a tide. Some clapped once, tentative and awkward. Padre Miguel folded his hands and smiled the kind of small, private smile that remembered every quiet kindness he had seen. Lupita's shoulders loosened. She covered her face and pressed her palms to her eyes as if to hold back something that had been stuck like lint. Esteban's jaw worked. Valentina stood up as if she might speak, and then sat again, her expression a complex piano of indignation, calculation, and just for an instant, something like fear. Before words could sharpen into weapons, Linciato said what legal men say when they want to remind people of a thing that should be easier to agree upon. These are the wishes of the testator, to be honored in the presence of witnesses. We will record signatures and deposit the reading in the municipal registry. His tone was small and official. He asked the witnesses to sign and left a pen on the table like a baton. Esteban went first. He came forward like a man who had lived his life making sure things were held in their right place and who now wanted to set his hand to say that he had seen the truth. He signed with a shaky scratch and looked at Rosa with eyes that had been softened by sleep and shame. "I should have spoken sooner," he said, voice low. "I thought it was not my place."
I thought I was keeping peace. I see now how peace can be cheap when it is only the absence of noise. His confession was not dramatic. It was the sort of quiet thing that is more shaming because it is plain. Lupita came next. Her hand trembled so much that the pen bobbed. When she lifted her head, she was red with emotion. "I was afraid," she said, and the smallness of the admission filled the room with a stronger light than any accusation might have. "I saw a thing the day of the coin. She stopped and pressed her fist to her mouth. "I saw a hand leave a coin in the pocket. I didn't tell. Valentina had asked me for a favor. I thought it would be nothing to me if I stayed quiet." Her voice broke like a thread pulled too tight. "I should have told the truth. I am sorry." The apology was not for the town's gossip alone. It was an apology to Rosa. who had been made to leave with only a mug and a photograph. Valentina sat very still. Her hands had become specters of composure. Her face had the pale authority of someone who had long believed social order was specifically her province to guard. For a moment she did nothing. Then she rose and walked to the front, like a woman making her penance measured and public, even while her mind worked through the numbers of social loss. "I have always tried to keep this house secure," she said in a voice that did not tremble. "If I acted in haste once, it was because I felt the duty of stewardship. I am responsible for protecting the estate." Her words were precise. They held no outright confession. But when she looked at Rosa, really looked, past the soot and beyond the public drama, something in her face changed. It was small. It was private. It was the tremor a woman has when she realizes that what she has held dear may have been held at someone else's cost. The camera lights in the corners blinked like patient eyes. Reporters leaned in with a hunger that had the shape of deadlines and headlines and would sort the city's story into daily crumbs. But in the room, the thing that most people wanted was not a headline. It was a human acknowledgement. Valentina's words, when they finally came, were not the dramatic collapse that gossip had long predicted. Instead, she took a breath that made the room smaller and said, "Rosa, I have been hasty. I have been proud. If I have wronged you, I am sorry." The apology was not a surrender of inheritance or a legal undoing of acts. It was a human instrument, an admission that could be used to begin the work of repair. That was the moment when the reading moved from law into the messy stewardship of human repair. Lenciato, his pen now set aside, suggested that the parties draft a simple protocol to carry out Don Rafael's wishes. They would create a small committee. Rosa would be named to it, alongside Esteban and Padre Miguel, with one representative from the Mendoza family and one from the workers.
It would oversee the endowment, the scheduling of wages, and the establishment of a clinic. The assembly murmured assent. Rosa, when asked to speak, did not speak as a victim. She did not make a grand speech. She pulled the photograph from her pocket and smoothed its edges like a prayer. "I do not want revenge," she said quietly. "I want a place where work is fair, where children can be cared for when their mothers must be in the field, where the men and women who sleep under this roof are not afraid to speak." Her voice was small but deliberate. It had an economy honed by years of counting beans and folding sheets. "I will take care of the rooms. I will make ledgers plain. I will not seek to be above anyone. I will ask only that promises be kept." Her request for simple structural reforms, pay on a set day, a fund for medical emergencies, a plan for housing repairs, a clinic to be built in the valley, had the strategic elegance of someone who knew what flatters an institution and what it cannot afford to ignore. Valentina's expression softened even further. She nodded, then, as if the action of nodding was a bridge she could cross without tumbling into shame. "Then let us put it in writing," she said, and a tired applause broke out as if the room had been holding an exhausted breath. A lawyer representing the small municipal office, someone who had neither the glamour of camera lights nor the intention to keep them, stepped forward to sketch a draft agreement that would give Don Rafael's testament actionable teeth. There would be signatures, a docket entry at the municipal registry, and an earmarked fund at the bank. It would not be instant grandeur. It would be ledger lines and municipal stamps and signatures that would take days to write, but it would be visible. In the following week, the town watched as what had once been rumor turned in a handful of legal steps into municipal paperwork. Lenciato recorded the reading officially, and the registry stamped the record. A modest trust was created at the local bank, with signatories including Valentina and Padre Miguel, and a representative from the Workers' Committee. The clinic idea, once a phrase in a will, became a plan. A small room in the edge of the estate would be refurbished with a donated cot and a rotating physician from the county health service. The servants' quarters were scheduled for repair. The ledger that Esteban kept would be made public, updated each week, with Rosa's oversight. People in the town reacted with the slow calculation of those who measure things by how their own days will change. Some praised the testament's clarity. Others still whispered that a reading could not erase the stings of weeks and months of rumor. Rumor, once birthed, rarely dies quiet. But small, practical proofs, receipts, funds, a sign reading, workers' clinic,
nailed to a wall, have a peculiarly persuasive presence. For Rosa, the days after the agreement were work reconfigured.
She found herself at a small table with a ledger and a pencil that left smudges, writing numbers in a hand that had once only cared for the perfect fold of a sheet. She learned, quickly, to make accounts simple and accessible. A line for wages, a line for the clinic, notes for repairs. She held meetings with the staff and with Esteban. She argued gently for a schedule that allowed mothers time to fetch water and take children to school. She counted coins and made budgets and told jokes in a voice that had long since learned that humor was a tool as useful as any ledger. Lupita volunteered for a strange task. She would be the liaison between the older women of the house and the young apprentices who were being taught to sew and cook. She did her work as if trying to stitch the torn fabric of trust. Esteban, chastened, proved steady. He repaired the roof over the servants' quarters with hands that had rarely been accused of moral torpor, and found in the task a new sort of purpose. Valentina kept a calculated distance at first, then began to appear at meetings with papers and lists, offering practical resources and a willingness to fund the clinic's first cot. Her atonement was not a melodramatic fall. It was an admission that stewardship meant more than inheritance. She attended to the garden with a gardener's humility, and once brought a pot of lemons. Don Rafael, who had said the paper must be read while he yet had breath to hear it, recovered at a pace that was slower than anyone would have liked, but steady. He often sat in the small parlor and watched the household move with the interest of a man who had always prized order. He would cough sometimes, his face drawn, and the town would note it and hurry their good words toward him in visits. He called Rosa his foolish woman, with a tenderness that made the nurses smile. She answered with a small grin that belongs to women who know how to make gentle ironies into affection. The clinic opened 2 months after Linciato read Don Rafael's words. It began as a single room with whitewashed walls and a donated cot. The county sent a nurse on rotation, and a retired doctor offered Saturday hours. Children came with scraped knees and feverish brows. Mothers came with concerns and the small dignity of people who had learned to ask for practical things rather than grand salvation. Rosa would sit in a chair by the door, offering a cup of coffee and an ear, and a practical suggestion: rest, compress, bring a list. The clinic sign read simply, "For the Valley's Care," a title that did not single out any one family, but welcomed all. Reform in a small town is rarely dramatic. It is the slow rearrangement of daily habits. The new wages schedule meant, practically, that mothers could buy milk without pleading. The repaired roofs meant children sleeping without rain in their faces.
A modest scholarship fund meant a handful of children were able to go to a school 20 minutes from the estate, instead of beginning work younger than necessary. These small changes did not make headlines for long, but they made mornings different. Valentina's public apology, given at a small afternoon meeting in the courtyard, was not theatrical. She spoke in the measured way of someone who had been taught that control over voice could be a means of civil reentry. "I am sorry," she said. "I let fear and the desire to protect what I thought I was owed cloud my judgment. I acted in haste and allowed a story to be written about a woman who deserved better." Her voice cracked on the last words. She then set a sum aside as an initial endowment for the clinic. People cried, some nodded, others held their faces like men trying to keep a memory from slipping. Not everyone forgave at once. Forgiveness, in Rosa's world, was a process of daily choices and small continuous kindnesses. Rosa did not push for Valentina to be embraced. She pushed for systems that would protect the weak from rumor. "I want policies," she would say at meetings, "so that a coin cannot decide a life." Her insistence on structural repair made her an unlikely administrator, a housekeeper who could keep ledgers, and who insisted that dignity be built into schedules. The summer that followed had the shape of steady labor and quieter gratitude. The servants' quarters were repainted, the children were enrolled for school, a nurse named Marta hung her bag in the clinic and began to keep regular hours. The house itself, scorched in a small place on the roof where the fire had eaten, was repaired with the same quiet attention that Don Rafael had always favored. No grand marble, only tidy tiles and a new coat of paint where ash had once blackened plaster. A small plaque hung in the entrance hall commemorating Don Rafael's wishes in simple script: "For the care of those who care for this house." Rosa found herself, slowly, given tasks that she was given a key ring with one key she had never owned before, the key to the committee room, a small paint-chipped office with a table and a ledger and a window that let in generous light. When she first turned the key with the steadiness that had become her habit, she felt a light domestic joy, like the one she had when a sheet has perfectly folded corners. People came to speak to her, a mother who needed help arranging school fees, an old man who needed a small operation,
a young apprentice asking for time off to visit his sick father. Rosa listened, and her answers were the kind that do not require mercy to be declared. They require work and accounts and a willingness to sometimes say no in order to keep the funds whole. Mercy for her had practical contours. There were difficult moments. An argument about a mislaid payment once almost split the committee.
Valentina and a local bank manager debated interest and timing with the force of two people who mistrusted each other's assumptions. Esteban had to be reminded to sign the public ledger promptly. Lupita had nights when shame returned like a cold wind, and she would knock on Rosa's door and ask how a woman recovers a name. Rosa offered food and hours, and the steady counsel of one who knew that time and practical measures heal some wounds. She encouraged Lupita to speak in public. She coached her through the first committee meeting and sat with her as she made a public admission of failing to speak sooner. The boy, Rosa's son, watched his mother become a small public figure and kept his own distance, the way children do when their parent is learning a new gravity. He still sat with soot in the seams of his fingers sometimes from helping with repairs. He still liked to spend mornings with his mother over the clay mug, her hand warm around it like a small, private home. He had learned to be helpful without being asked, and he took pride in a quiet way when people greeted his mother by name in the market. 6 months after the reading, the estate had the comfortable, practical air of a place where wrongs had not been erased, but were being addressed. The clinic had a small sign, a bench where mothers sat and swapped bread recipes, a cot for emergencies. The servants' quarters smelled of fresh paint and the particular clean odor of linen that has been folded because someone cared. The ledger on Rosa's desk had a neat column of entries, and her handwriting had a new boldness when she signed her name as Rosa Hernandez, committee member. The town's gossip had not vanished. It had been channeled toward the kinds of stories towns always enjoy: cookery contests, the school's harvest festival, the occasional scandal about a mare's shoes. The awful architecture of rumor could not be entirely demolished by law or apology. It could only be redirected. On an ordinary afternoon after a committee meeting, Rosa walked the estate with Padre Miguel. They moved through the garden where Valentina had planted lemon trees, small, stubborn things, and watched as a group of children chased one another across the yard, their laughter bright and absolute. Padre Miguel's presence was, as always, a kind of steadying frame. He had been present at the reading, had sat with Rosa in the hospital corridor when Don Rafael coughed, and had mediated meetings with the patient diplomacy of a man who believed communities could be mended. "You did well," Padre Miguel said, though he knew she would resist praise. "You did what this place did not expect, and it has had to learn how to respond." "It wasn't me," Rosa corrected, in the manner of someone who kept her own virtues small lest they crowd out the work. "It was the night and a man's breath, and the fact that people had to choose. I did what was there to do." Padre Miguel smiled. "And because you did it, we now have to do what is hard."
Repair is more difficult than spectacle. They stood in the courtyard and watched as Esteban directed a small team, setting tiles on the repaired roof. Lupita moved between them, carrying a tray with glasses of agua fresca, and sent a smile Rosa's way. From the windows of the clinic came the murmur of a radio and the clipped laugh of a nurse. It was not the end of memory, but it was the shape of a new afternoon, quieter, slower, replanned. At night, when the house settled into itself and lights winked from windows like arguments resolved into agreement, Rosa would take out the photograph and the clay mug and sit at a small table in the kitchen with her son. He would ask modest questions about the day. She would answer with practical stories: how the ledger balanced, how the nurse had found a child's fever to be only a cold, what the gardener had said about the lemon tree. Sometimes she would tell him ever so briefly about the night of the fire, not the blaze and the terror so much as the way the valley rose up with hands that either wanted to help or to hurt. She told him that some people would always choose one or the other, and that a life was often defined by which kind of hand you offered back. In the quiet hours, Don Rafael would sometimes call for her, and she would go. He had begun to set a little dish of lemon peel at the elbow of his chair, and his gifts were the small, spare things that mean more than gold: advice on how to trim a hedge, a story about a younger day in which he had made a foolish bargain and learned from it. The two of them would sit and speak of the mundane with the affection of people who had been bound for years by work and mutual small mercies. He had taught her some practicalities about managing a house's resources. She taught him how to measure a day by the number of meals that came without complaint. They were, in their way, a diplomatic pair who ruled a modest territory defined by responsibility. Valentina's presence grew less sharp. She attended the committee as a member, but less and less as a monopolizer of decisions. Her apology had settled into daily acts. She insisted upon paying for the repaired windows. She arranged a small Christmas celebration for the children of workers. Some of her gestures were clumsy, others were earnest. In private, she and Rosa shared a short conversation, in which Valentina admitted how lonely management had felt. Rosa listened, and then offered one of those small practical counsels she had honed over years. When you are in charge, make sure you are not alone. Ask people you trust to keep you honest. It was not an embrace, it was a manual for governance, given with the sort of dignity that refused to make monstrous the woman who had once exiled her. One morning, the municipal clerk called Rosa to the registry and asked if she would sign a small public notice acknowledging the implementation of Don Rafael's testamentary wishes. She went with her son at her side. The clerk handed her a parchment that listed the reforms, the trust, the clinic, the committee, and asked her to sign as a witness. She did so with a hand that did not tremble. People in the registry, men who had once been entirely uninterested in the private affairs of housekeepers, stood and tilted their heads like men surprised into respect. The settlement was not a fairy tale. There were still nights when someone in the marketplace would mutter about old slights. There were still bureaucrats who moved slowly, and a bank manager who annoyed Rosa with a cautiousness that bordered on cowardice. But the major elements were in place. Law had been used to give the paper teeth, and people, slowly, sometimes grudgingly, had been persuaded to lift the paper together. The boy grew taller. He began to help Rosa more in the ledger and to sit in the committee meeting sometimes, a patient presence who climbed on a chair and listened as older people discussed the distribution of resources. One afternoon, he brought home a certificate for a school contest in which his drawing had won a small prize. Rosa pinned the paper on the wall of their small kitchen, between the clay mug and the photograph. It felt like an altar. The winter after the reading, the town had a festival where the estate presented a small exhibit on their repair, and the clinic held open hours and served lemonade. Children performed plays about brave women. The mayor gave a short speech about the importance of community accountability. For a few hours, the town breathed as if guilt and generosity could be stored together. At the festival, Esteban raised a glass and, with a voice that had the tremble of a man who had learned humility, toasted Rosa for saving a life and then working to save others in different ways. Lupita, a little steadier now, offered a short public apology to the town and to Rosa for her silence. Valentina stood to the side and watched, then summoned some small courage and set aside a portion of funds to create a scholarship for apprentices. Her last act of the evening was to find Rosa and place a carefully wrapped box of lemons on her kitchen stoop, the bright citric smell cutting the cold. The moments of public reconciliation were not the end. They were rooms in a house that would require constant maintenance. Rosa learned to be patient in ways she had not had to be. Patience in leadership is different than the patience of a woman who irons collars. It requires firmness and the willingness to close doors when necessary. But she kept her humility and her practical sense, and she chose not to be consumed by the glare that briefly had been aimed at her. One night, several months after the reading, the house had a quietness that felt like a blessing. Rosa sat at her small table, with the photograph and the clay mug. Her son had fallen asleep early from an afternoon of games, his small face relieved of the complicated lines of adolescence. Outside, the moon hung like a pale coin over the valley. Rosa folded the photograph carefully and placed it back into the scarf she kept in her drawer. She thought of the woman in the photograph, the small mercies she had been shown, and of the long arc that had turned rumor into a public deed. There was no triumphant speech to be made. Her life, she thought, would keep the same rhythms: early mornings, the fold of sheets, the counting of moneys, the precise care of wounds. But there was a different rhythm now within the work, the knowledge that a life of service could be acknowledged in a way that made the lives of others safer. She felt a quiet satisfaction that was neither loud nor small, like the satisfaction of a well-made bed. Don Rafael, whose cough had settled into a morning ritual of warm tea and slow stories, called once from his parlor to ask if she would bring him a lemon tart he had once made for him. She baked it the next day and brought it on a plate that warmed between her hands. He smiled when he took it, the way a man smiles when he knows the kindness he has bestowed has ripened in one small, private way. "You saved a life," he said, voice small. "You did what was honest. I always knew that." His thanks was not the sort that rewrites the public record. It was the private gratitude of a man who had lived long enough to see what mattered. At the center of everything, Rosa kept her hands busy. She entered numbers in the ledger, counted out wages,
instructed a young apprentice on the correct angle to fold a sheet. She taught the boy to mend a tear with the same patience she used to mend reputations: straight stitches, consistent tension, minimal fuss. She told him sometimes, in a voice that was both practical and tender, that courage is not only the act of running into a room filled with smoke. Courage is also the act of sitting with a ledger and balancing the days so others can breathe. Her son listened and learned, and in his small way, began to see the work of governance as ordinary heroism. When people asked her about the night of the fire, she did not romanticize it. She described, simply, the heat of the stairs and the feeling of someone's pulse beneath her fingers. She would sometimes, when asked about Valentina, say only this: "People make choices. Some are quick to hurt, others are quick to mend. We must choose what kind of people we will be." Months later, at the little doorway where the clinic stood proud and modest, a small plaque was nailed into the wood. It read, "In memory of small mercies, may this clinic heal what rumor could not." Rosa stood with Padre Miguel and a few staff when the ribbon was cut. Her son took a photograph of the moment with a camera borrowed from a neighbor. Esteban and Lupita were there, Valentina too, for the sake of the house she loved in her own way. People clapped in the polite way that communities do when they are pleased to have done a deed.
The clinic's first patient was a child with a scraped knee. The nurse washed it, applied a plaster, and sent the child home with a cordial smile. The day was ordinary, but ordinary days are often where justice is made practical. People came and left. The ledger on Rosa's desk had a new line that read, "Clinic, supplies," and another that read, "Education fund, enrollment." She folded the page and closed the ledger with a thumb. It was not the end. It was the continuation of what she had started. In the late hour before the town slept, Rosa returned to the same small kitchen table. She took out her journal, an old, battered book where she wrote the things she wanted to remember, and she set the clay mug beside it. She thought of the fire that had taken the roof's tiles and not the life inside, and of how many lives were held together by mundane acts. She wrote a single line, not as a prayer, but as a note to herself. Keep the ledger fair, keep the doors open, keep the children warm. She closed the book and looked at the photograph once more, the edges soft from being handled. The valley outside her window had acquired a different light. It was not magic. It was the modest illumination of a place that had rearranged its priorities. A clinic sign, repaired roofs, a schedule that promised a wage on Friday. More than that, it was the knowledge that one woman, who had prepared beans and folded sheets, and who had once been forced into exile, had the quiet courage to move toward the things that needed fixing, and the practical wisdom to ask for repairs rather than revenge. As the night moved on, a faint breeze carried the smell of lemons from Valentina's trees. Rosa sat with her son for a moment, his hand small in hers. She thought of those who had chosen shame and those who had chosen to speak the truth. She thought of Esteban's slow repentance and Lupita's honest tears. She thought of Padre Miguel's silent hands and Lanchato's patient law. She realized that what had begun in a single act of rescue had become a series of days in which the town had relearned how to care for its own. If Rosa's courage moved you, share this story. Tell someone about the woman who ran toward the smoke and then stayed to mend what the flames did not touch. If you were in her place, would you have forgiven? Would you have built a clinic, settled ledgers, and taught a child how to sew a seam? Like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below, because stories like this ask us to think about how we choose to repair the lives around us.